Welcome, everyone, to another episode of our Experts of the Americas series. In this four-part set of conversations, we're unpacking one of the most important and often misunderstood transformations across our hemisphere, Latin America and the Caribbean's growing engagement with China, and how this shift is realigning US-Latin America relations in an increasingly multipolar world. Each episode brings in a leading specialist to help decode the economic, political, and strategic dimensions of China-LAC engagement, from dual-use ports, energy and mining, to narratives around debt, influence, and regional competition. We will be unpacking more of this today. My name is Miguel Escoto, young global professional at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center, and today I'm joined by Parsifal D'Sola, Executive Director of the Andres Bello Foundation and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. Parsifal's work explores how infrastructure, resource acquisition, and political engagement intersects with broader great power dynamics across Latin America and the Caribbean. Now let's dive in. Parsifal, in our introductory episode with ALAC non-resident senior fellow, Dr. Victoria Chon, we explored China's commercial ties in the region. Now, to open today's conversation, I'd like to ask you, something often repeated but not really understood is why exactly have Latin American and Caribbean nations leaned so heavily into Chinese-funded critical infrastructure, even amid concerns about opacity and so-called debt trap diplomacy. Now, what exactly makes these projects appealing for Latin American nations in the short term, despite the possible long-term risks?
No, thank you, Miguel. Well, the first thing I would like to say is that there are documented, there is strong evidence that these loans, especially in the 2000s, when this, the big boom in Chinese finance, not only Latin America, but across the globe, exploded, that they don't have the same standards in terms of transparency, and but truth be told, there is. I have to push back on the debt trap narrative. There is no strong evidence of any sort, not even weak evidence of any sort. This is mostly a narrative that's become prevalent in the United States, but this has mostly been disproven by academics and economists who have studied these laws. Additionally, they're very varied, and they've been evolving over the last 2 decades. When it comes to Latin America and the Caribbean, yeah, we've seen a very diverse array of infrastructure projects being financed by these loans, but this is only in a set of countries. Financing mechanisms are not only they're not only loans. It's a mistake to paint them all with the same brush. They do vary widely, and especially over the last 5 years, we've seen these narrow down to much more, smaller, targeted projects, shifting away from these large infrastructure projects like the Port of Shanghai, which made a lot of headlines. But in my opinion, these very large projects are a thing of the past. And why do Latin American countries choose? Well, because they show up. That's that's a basic reason. Chinese companies, state-owned and private, and everything in the middle, have been showing up. They've been participating in licitations, and they've been winning projects, left and right. The same cannot be said for U.S. companies and Western companies. This also been well documented, have mainly been retrieving from the region when it comes to infrastructure. Services and other areas, that's a different story. But if we solely focus on infrastructure, the PRC companies are here, and they're the ones actually willing to engage and to construct these projects.
Something constantly heard is the great power competition here in the United States. Now, for our viewers unfamiliar with the term, in Latin America, it plays out not through direct confrontation, but through investment, infrastructure, and strategic access point, with rivaling US, Chinese, and to a lesser degree, Russian capital and projects. Now, focusing on the Chinese finance projects, like you mentioned, the Chancay port in Peru or the Neuquén Espacio Lejano station in Argentina, they have repeatedly made international headlines. Now, the question is, when it comes to projects like these that have certain military, civil, or dual use implications, are they genuinely a cause for concern right now? And if so, for who? Local governments, the United States, or the broader international community?
I think that it's important how you frame the question for who, because if you're sitting in Washington, you'll have one answer. But if you're sitting across the region, odds are that concerns will be very, very different from those in the United States, and they also do vary. But I don't have to tell you how, diverse Latin American countries are, and their, let's say, proximity to the United States also um, becomes part of the equation, this balancing equation between a United States, especially under the Trump administration, that is much more willing to use economic coercion to push countries to get involved in domestic issues, and well, countries have to now take that into account in their own assessments vis-a-vis the PRC. Um, eh, should there be concerns from Latin American countries? My opinion is that yes. It's the short answer. Primarily because, well, A, China is a global power, and B, its system of governance. This is a country whose foreign policy, whose companies are pretty much aligned with the central government, and they seek to promote um, to align themselves with the interests of the party, both at home and abroad. So that is, it's not the same, and there tends to be a false equivalence between Chinese state-owned enterprises as well as private sectors, especially private ones, when they tend to, a lot of people, a lot of analysts, politicians, be it because of an agenda or just simply a lack of understanding, which I think it's an important uh, problem that we see across the region in elite politics and elite decision making when it comes to China, to treating it or to viewing it just through the traditional lens of great power politics, without paying much attention to the nature of the Chinese government, how it operates, and how its company. So there should be more scrutiny for these projects, but frankly, they're also filling a vacuum in terms of infrastructure projects. So you would have to look at a specific case by case assessment, which is something that, frankly, governments do not have the resources, and when they do, they again, there seems to be this false equivalence seen through the prism of great power politics.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting really the decision-making aspect of these things and what these political leaders and governments are taking into consideration when they do sign up for these investments. Something else that I wanted to ask was that, across the region, these governments often compare US, European, Chinese funded projects before they choose a partner to go ahead and execute them. Now, I'd like to ask which countries tend to do this the most often and why? And when they do make these comparisons, what differences do you see in financing, speed, political conditions, or even strategic implications that stand out the most?
I wouldn't say countries, I would say governments. Because usually when uh, a specific government begins talking about risks or differences between Chinese and Western counterparts, it's usually through the ideological lens. We've seen this with Argentina and President Milei, where there's clear, ideological alignment between the Milei government and the Trump administration. And this is the where we do see greater scrutiny on the Chinese side, on Chinese projects, and more emphasis on differentiating international actors. But I would say, like, by and large, most countries do not differentiate. A lot of countries are just, happy to receive foreign direct investment or, international companies, regardless of where they're from.
Also, the decisions that these governments make is very important to highlight, especially when we see the different varying degrees of governance styles in Latin America. We've noticed with more authoritarian governments, such as in Nicaragua, where over 500,000 hectares of mining concessions have been awarded to Chinese companies in just the past 3 years. So when it comes to the authoritarian model of engagement, should governments view this or treat this as routine trade and investment, or is this a domain that you think requires closer strategic attention?
No, I definitely think it requires closer strategic attention and assessment by every single country, precisely because of what I commented earlier. China it's an authoritarian country, and its companies are very much well aligned with its, the party's interests. So this is something that um, uh, especially nowadays with, greater tensions between the United States and China. Um, Countries are just saying, basically taking a step back and taking a so-called non-aligned approach, which I think is frankly a mistake. But that's usually the angle that we see from most governments. As you mentioned, and this is connected to your previous question, there's obviously, ideological alignment on the authoritarian sense, with Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, who do differentiate, obviously, putting, China and on a positive light, and contrasting with, anti-US rhetoric. Countries should not single out Chinese companies, because I think that would be a mistake, but a greater understanding on how these companies operate. This should be done to every single international actor, not make it a China issue,
Mhm.
because then, well, uh, it becomes political. Making it about China will create its own, frictions between these countries and the PRC. So it's more about, institutions, transparency, supporting democratic norms, and again, not make it a China issue.
This takes me to my next question, actually, and it's something that I feel we don't really hear a lot about, and this is Latin America and the Caribbean side of the civilian perspective, what the locals are thinking. Do their perceptions of China match the positions often taken by their political leaders, or do you think that there's a noticeable gap between public opinion and official policy? If so, what explains it?
This is a very hard question to answer because, well, for starters, there's no, large scale study of the sorts. There are some a superficial analysis coming from NGOs like Latino Barometro, but these are very superficial. They don't and they only take into account a small group of countries. So um, this is more about, my own perception from, the work that we do at the foundation uh, engagement with our network of journalists and other academics. So that being said, I think there is a disconnect between the population and governments when it comes to China. Um, Depending on the central issues of a specific government, you will see them taking, certain positions.
Yeah, and as we speak more on this dynamic, and as we've seen, countries navigate, the PRC or Taiwan flip, my next question is, as China seemingly is deepening its footprint through all these infrastructure projects throughout the region, what trends should governments be watching out in the next 5 to 10 years? And what factors do you think will shape the region's ability to maintain its sovereignty and overall strategic autonomy when it comes to Chinese security, technology, and sovereignty impacts?
Sadly, I would say that security, especially when it comes to technology or um, uh, information and communication technologies, the region is very far back in terms of regulations, in terms of, just data privacy. And I have no doubt that this is going to become an issue in the coming, 5 to 10 years, having to deal with a greater presence of Chinese companies, uh, especially when it comes to data privacy. We see an increasing number of data centers popping up across the region. Just last week, TikTok announced its first large infrastructure database in Brazil, um, and I think that's definitely an area to pay attention to. Um, and there's the question mark about the United States, because again, the US has a very large influence in the region. It's we well, the national security policy just came out, and we could definitely see, that the next 3 years, this deployment of the military in the Caribbean. This is not a one-off. This is going to be present, and we are seeing a shift also in the ideological landscape of governments, shifting to the right, and a lot of these political parties want to engage in a deeper level with the United States. So how that plays out is going to have an impact on the relationship these countries have with China. We've seen the policy, but how that is going to materialize is a different thing. Is this gonna be a sort of will there be, financial backing for developing digital infrastructure within that policy? Will there be a scenarios on putting countries to choose between the United States and China? So I think it's more the ball is on the US side, and countries will react, adapt. But I think there's definitely a shift that we're seeing. Is a country that has it's a region that is coming out from, 2 decades of very left-leaning governments. We've seen the repercussions of, the Maduro in Venezuela, the instability caused by its, criminal networks, the you know the a huge migration coming out from Venezuela, and both governments and populations are very much aware of the reality within Venezuela. But again, it's a very big question mark on how this policy will be implemented.
Thank you for really raising up the whole policy and implementation process, what we may or may not see coming out to happen in the next few years. In the United States, we've had recent changes with US foreign aid disbursement and handling. What vacuums, or are there any vacuums left for the advantage of China in Latin America with these changes in foreign aid?
The first thing is that this is going to remain a vacuum. China doesn't have the institutions, and frankly, I don't see any evidence that they're willing to fill this vacuum. China simply doesn't do foreign assistance and developmental aid. It's a very different model. So sadly, this vacuum is just going to stay a vacuum. The EU doesn't have the financial muscle, and nor I think, frankly, the interest of committing to such level of international aid. So yes, I think this is going to remain a vacuum. I do see one area where the PRC does benefit from this, and it's precisely in the work of journalists and the media and coverage. And it's investigative journalism networks have been historically dependent on US funding, on US aid, on State Department grants. And without those, they simply break down. They start operating. They've been closing up shop. A lot of the organizations that we used to work with simply couldn't continue operating because of the cuts. So it's not specifically about China, because I'll give you one clear example. If there is an NGO in Brazil that does work on the environment, and they track the operations of all international companies, and that NGO has to shut down, well, it indirectly, benefits the companies that are doing the wrong.
Overall, thank you for this really rich, nuanced conversation, Parsifal. Your insights helped illuminate the complex realities shaping China-Latin America relations today and what's at stake for the region as the global competition intensifies. To everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Experts of the Americas. In coming episodes, we'll dive into cybercrime, transnational criminal organization, and Chinese development finance impacts on China-LAC relations, and the bigger current reshaping hemispheric security. If you enjoyed this conversation, follow, subscribe, and stay tuned for what's next at theatlanticcouncil.org, and be sure to find us on social media for updates, bonus content, and announcements about future guests. We'll see you next time, and thank you for joining us today.